The IDF responded Wednesday night to a couple of rockets fired at Israel from the Gaza Strip. One reportedly fell in an open field near the Sha'ar HaNegev Regional Council, and no injuries or damages were reported. Another rocket reportedly fell backwards, landing within the Gaza Strip.
Still, red alert sirens were sounded in the southern Gaza border communities, and the army responded against a Hamas guard post in the central Gaza Strip with tank fire. As Hamas is in control of the Gaza Strip, Israel holds the terror group responsible for any attacks emanating from within its territory. But former Defense Minister Avigdor Lieberman again criticized the seemingly lax response, saying that confrontation is inevitable and that there's no need to wait for human casualties on our side. Quote, "We must return to a policy of targeted assassinations and massive damage to terrorist infrastructure," end quote. Meanwhile, the IDF also conducted a series of arrests across the West Bank and in the north. On Twitter, the IDF reported overnight that in cooperation with the ISA, the Border Police, and the Israel Police, 8 Palestinians were arrested in the West Bank, and the suspects were all wanted for involvement in terror against civilians and soldiers and other popular violence. The detainees have all since been transferred for questioning too. Then, finally, in the north on Thursday morning, Walla News reported that a Lebanese citizen was arrested after crossing illegally into Israel. The man crossed over near the village of Har Dov, and he's also been transferred for questioning.
It's now been nearly a week since Israel revoked the mandate for the Temporary International Presence in Hebron, or the TIPH, and several international organizations are still heavily protesting the move. In fact, the United States on Wednesday blocked a proposed resolution at the United Nations Security Council condemning Israel's decision to remove the organization. The resolution was introduced last week by Kuwait and Indonesia, among others, in a closed-door Security Council session. And according to the AFP, the statement calls for calm and restraint in the region following Israel's, quote, regretful and unilateral decision, end quote. The resolution goes on to reportedly focus on the importance of the TIPH mandate and its efforts to foster calm in a highly sensitive and fragile area, which now, quote, risks further deterioration as reflected in the escalating cycle of violence, end quote. Turkish officials in the foreign ministry similarly stated that Turkey strongly condemns Israel's termination of the mandate of the TIPH and expects this political decision to be reversed. But critics of the TIPH point out that the so-called temporary force has been in Hebron for over 20 years now, as violence and anti-Israel sentiments have only grown, meaning that this decision is far less political than it may seem. In fact, the TIPH is directly implicated in many incidents that have contributed to the conflict and division in Hebron. Over the summer of 2018, for example, Israeli Chadashot TV News aired footage of a TIPH staffer slapping a young Jewish boy in the face so hard that his kippah or head covering went flying off. Then a few weeks later, a TIPH worker in uniform was caught on video slashing car tires belonging to Israeli settlers. Additionally, TIPH personnel have been accused of often clashing with Israeli soldiers at checkpoints and disrupting security operations. It is this that eventually led Netanyahu to revoke the mandate, explaining that, quote, "We will not allow the continuation of an international force that acts against us," end quote. Just a day after dozens of top Israeli politicians signed a document in support of the Nachal movement, which aims to settle at least 2 million Israelis in the West Bank, an Israeli West Bank monitoring group is now reporting that that wish might be granted sooner than later.
According to reports by the Associated Press, the West Bank Jewish Population Statistics Project is reporting that the population in Israeli settlements is exploding at rates far higher than that of the general population. In fact, the data that was published shows an increase in the settlement population of 3.3%, nearly 75% higher than the general population's growth of 1.9%. Additionally, the organization also predicted that that rate will only increase under the current political climate. Baruch Gordon, the director of the project, reportedly explained that not only are most of the settlers religious, meaning that they already have a higher birth rate than average, but also the White House's attitudes on the situation have made settlement more normalized. Speaking to the AP, Gordon said that since the change of the United States administration, the atmosphere for construction permits has become much easier. They're being given with greater ease. He added that, quote, "I think possibly the next report, and certainly in the ones after that, I think we'll start to see a huge surge in the numbers here," end quote. Now, the AP could not get the Interior Ministry to confirm these numbers, but the ministry is reportedly in contact with the project and says that the data sounds legitimate. Also, the report was compiled by former Knesset member Yoav Katz of the National Union Party.
President Donald Trump gave his second formal State of the Union address Tuesday night after a 2-week delay due to the government shutdown. And the speech also comes as Congress and the president attempted to avert another shutdown scheduled for February 15th. Ironically, despite the major divide in American politics today, though, in his speech on Tuesday, Trump championed the theme of choosing greatness, stating that, quote, "Together we can break decades of political stalemate, we can bridge old divisions, heal old wounds, build new coalitions, forge new solutions, and unlock the extraordinary promise of America's future," end quote. With respect to the Middle East, though, Trump seemed to fall back to his old braggadocious habits as he listed his various accomplishments.
One of the most complex set of challenges we face and have for many years is in the Middle East. Our approach is based on principled realism, not discredited theories that have failed for decades to yield progress. For this reason, my administration recognized the true capital of Israel and proudly opened the American embassy in Jerusalem.
He also repeated campaign vows to return American troops home from Syria and to confront the radical regime of Iran, saying that, quote, "They do bad things. So to ensure this corrupt dictatorship never acquires nuclear weapons, I withdrew the United States from the disastrous Iran nuclear deal," end quote. Still, at the end of the Trump State of the Union address, many were left wanting, especially as Trump's approval rating has fallen down to 34% now, whereas it was 42% a month ago. And the reason, as expected, seems to be Trump's insistence on building the Mexican border wall, which even many of his own allies in the Republican Party warned him would not pass. An attempted stabbing attack at the Tomb of the Patriarchs was foiled by IDF soldiers on Sunday after an Arab resident of Hebron was caught entering the holy site armed with a knife. According to Israeli police reports, the roughly 20-year-old Palestinian suspect first walked towards the security inspection post with a group of tourists, but the suspect was behaving suspiciously and did not appear to border police to be a part of the larger group. So they pulled him aside for a closer inspection. Well, their suspicions proved fruitful when the suspect, found out by security, pulled a large kitchen knife from out from under his clothing. With weapons aimed at the ready, however, he threw the knife to the ground and raised his hands in the air. No injuries were reported, and the suspect was detained for further questioning. Initial reports confirmed that he was there with intent to carry out a stabbing terror attack, though. The IDF neutralized 2 Palestinian suspects on Monday night who reportedly threw explosives at soldiers by the Jalame security crossing near Jenin. No soldiers or civilians were injured in the incident, but according to the army, soldiers responded with live fire, killing one suspect and seriously wounding the other.
The elder suspect, who was killed by a shot to the head, has been identified as 19-year-old Abed Alatawalbe, while the other, an unidentified 15-year-old, was shot in the buttocks. He's since been transferred to the hospital for treatment, but that hasn't been the only such incident in recent days, and the IDF was busy elsewhere in the West Bank as well. At least 25 Palestinian suspects across the West Bank were detained overnight Monday, all for alleged involvement in terrorism and violent acts. Additionally, among the arrests was Suhair Barghouti of Khobar near Ramallah, the mother of Salih and Asim Barghouti, who are alleged to have committed multiple terror attacks resulting in several deaths. The army also announced the demolition of the Barghoutis' home, along with plans to demolish an apartment Salih had been using in the near future. The family will have 3 days now to appeal the demolition order on the apartment, but it's unlikely to be accepted as the courts have already rejected the appeal over Suhair Barghouti's house. Further, the Barghoutis have a long family history with the Hamas terror group, and Asim had already been imprisoned for 11 years on terror-related charges. He was released in 2017, though, only to later commit these latest attacks with his brother. The two first shot up an Ofra settlement bus stop, injuring 7 and causing the death of an emergency-born infant. Asim later fired at another stop near Givat Asaf, killing 2 soldiers, Sergeant Yosef Cohen and Staff Sergeant Yovel Mor Yosef. He also injured 2 other people. Salih has since been killed while evading capture, though, and Asim was arrested ahead of another planned attack. He was detained with an assault rifle, ammunition, night vision technology, and more.
The Israeli Defense Ministry on Wednesday reported that the United States Army is now purchasing a number of Israel's Iron Dome missile defense batteries for immediate testing and eventual use in a field.
The announcement comes a few months after initial reports on a potential sale were revealed, and after the United States Army requested $373 million from Congress to purchase Iron Dome systems by 2020 as well. And according to an IDF statement, quote, "The Iron Dome systems will be used for deployed United States military forces as a defense system against a wide range of ballistics and airborne threats, and they'll be tested in the long run as part of a range of possible United States military responses to aerial threats," end quote. Now, Prime Minister and Defense Minister Netanyahu, among others, already praised the purchase, calling it a great achievement for Israel and lauding how, quote, "This is yet another expression of the strengthening of our strong alliance with the U.S. and an expression of Israel's rising status in the world." Netanyahu continued that Israel has an iron dome and an iron fist, and our systems know how to deal with any threat, quote, both defensive and offensive. I would not recommend our enemies to try us, end quote. Israeli ambassador to the UN, Dani Danon, similarly tweeted then that this decision improves the bond between the countries and that Israel's powerful tech will now help the United States defeat its enemies. Further, after the announcement was made, the IDF also released this promotional video on how important the Iron Dome system is and how it saves lives. The Iron Dome works by tracking incoming short-range projectiles by radar, and then it maps out the trajectory of the rocket and predicts where it will land before deciding whether or not to intercept. Additionally, to date, the Iron Dome system has reportedly intercepted over 2,000 rockets from Gaza alone. As for longer-range threats, the Iron Dome system works in tandem with the Arrow, David's Sling, and various other interception systems. Still, for the United States, the Iron Dome is enough for now. And United States Army Colonel Patrick Sieber explained on Wednesday that the Iron Dome will be assessed and experimented as a system that is currently available to protect deployed United States military service members against a wide variety of indirect fire threats and aerial threats, adding that while Iron Dome has been in operational use by the Israeli Air Force since 2011 and proven effective in combat, it should be noted that the U.S. Army will assess a variety of other options for its long-term indirect fire protection capability, or IFPC solution, as well.
Meanwhile, as the IDF clashed with Palestinians in the West Bank, Israel's southern security forces were also on guard, preventing infiltrations and attacks along the Gaza border.
On Friday, roughly 10,000 Palestinians again came to the Gaza-Israel border to riot, throw stones and explosives, attempt to infiltrate or damage the fence, burn tires, and more. The IDF responded with rubber-coated rounds and some live fire. And then on Sunday morning, the army arrested 5 Palestinians who had crossed illegally into Israel from the southern Gaza Strip. The men were not armed, however, and were transferred to the Shin Bet for further questioning. But despite these and other weekend incidents, Hamas is said to be mulling a reduction in the violent outbursts along the border as part of negotiations with Egypt. In return, the Rafah border crossing between Egypt and Gaza would be reopened, a move that would be highly popular for Hamas at a time that the Gaza terror group is fighting for survival both from Israel and the West Bank. Hamas has become increasingly isolated following the PA's decision to dissolve its government and form a new one without Hamas members. Hamas's parliamentary and government officials in the West Bank and East Jerusalem have even been arrested by PA forces recently now that they've lost their diplomatic immunities. And Israel, in the meantime, has vowed that neither elections in the Palestinian Authority nor in Israel would prevent a heavy military response to Hamas's escalation from the Strip.
All right, by the way, in an update to this last story, the 5 Gaza suspects arrested crossing into Israel earlier this morning were later found to have hidden knives and wire cutters on their persons. Then later, 2 Jordanian nationals were arrested crossing the border illegally into Israel from Jordan, but they were not reportedly armed. They too were taken in for questioning, though. In other news, Israeli security forces arrested 17 Palestinians overnight on Monday in connection to terror-related activities. 16 were arrested in a series of raids in the West Bank, but 1 was arrested as he tried to infiltrate Israel from the Gaza Strip, and after he was detained, a knife was then found hidden near his point of entry.
Then, a suspected incendiary balloon was also found in the Eshkol Regional Council. Police sappers have been called to investigate, and all 17 arrested suspects have since been transferred for questioning. Further, this is the 4th such infiltration incident in just 24 hours. Operations and arrests may finally be slowing in frequency, though, at least around the Gaza Strip, as they come just days after Israel began working on the final components of the new Gaza security barrier. Prime Minister Netanyahu announced the construction at the start of this week's cabinet meeting.
בסוף השבוע התחלנו בהקמת המכשול העילי בגבול עזה. המכשול ימנע חדירת טרוריסטים מעזה לשטחנו מעל פני הקרקע. ולצד זה אני מבקש להבהיר. אם בעזה לא ישמרו על השקט, נדע לקבל החלטות גם בתקופת בחירות ולא נהסס לפעול.
And according to Brigadier General Eran Ophir, the head of the IDF's fence building division, the new fence is, quote, especially suited to threats from the Gaza Strip, end quote, and includes 65 kilometers of smart fence technology made of galvanized steel and stretching all the way from Zikim Beach in the north to the Kerem Shalom crossing in the south. And upon completion, the barrier will be one of several designed to end Gazan attacks. The newly upgraded border, the underground border to prevent tunnels, and the sea barrier to prevent naval incursions.
United States President Donald Trump on Sunday vowed to continue with his planned military withdrawal from Syria, but citing the need to protect Israel, among other things, Trump then also rolled back on the scale of that withdrawal, saying that some American forces would remain in Iraq in order to keep an eye on Iran. Since initially announcing the immediate troop withdrawal from Syria in December, though, the plan has been met with a number of delays and rollbacks. Last week, the Senate even voted on a measure that completely opposes the withdrawal at this time. Rather than stay, as he's been advised, however, the president unveiled a new compromise-type plan in an interview on Sunday on CBS's Face the Nation. Trump said that the roughly 2,000 troops still in Syria would leave in a matter of time, but that, quote, we have to protect Israel and we have to protect other things that we have, end quote. He then added that the United States has an unbelievable and expensive military base built in Iraq, and that we might as well keep it because, quote, I want to be looking a little bit at Iran because Iran is a real problem, end quote. This announcement also comes just after Iran unveiled a new cruise missile during its anniversary celebrations over the weekend. But while Trump's news is probably music to Israel's ears, it seems Iraq didn't get the latest memo. Iraqi President Salih even responded on Monday that President Trump did not ask for, nor was he given permission to remain stationed in his country. A group of 40 ambassadors from the United Nations arrived in Israel this week for a 5-day visit organized by Israeli UN Ambassador Dani Danon. And to begin, the group held meetings with top Israeli officials and took a tour of the cross-border terror tunnels dug from Lebanon by Hezbollah.
And while standing by the Lebanese border, the delegation was given a first-hand look at what Israel's Operation Northern Shield was for. But during the meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu in Jerusalem earlier in the day, the premier revealed how Iran was pulling the strings in Lebanon's government.
A great shift has taken place in the Middle East, and that shift is the rise of the aggressive theocracy of Iran that seeks to conquer the Middle East, eliminate Israel, and dominate many other parts of the world.
The Lebanese parliament last Thursday finally ended a 9-month deadlock and formed a new government where Iranian proxy terror group Hezbollah now holds 2 ministries and a Ministry of State. There are also Hezbollah allies in other sections of the government. So Netanyahu explained that, quote, Iran has many branches. One of them is Hezbollah, which has now joined the Lebanese government. Although this is a misleading description, because Hezbollah actually controls the Lebanese government, and this means that Iran controls the Lebanese government, end quote. The Israeli prime minister then continued to stress again how Israel is committed to preventing Iranian encroachment on Israel's borders, no matter where from, quote, Lebanon, Syria, or Iran itself, adding that in preventing Iranian aggression, Israel is also, quote, protecting our neighbors and world peace, end quote. In Lebanon, on the other hand, senior Hezbollah leader Sheikh Naim Qassem responded to Netanyahu's allegations by denying that Iran had any control over the organization. He added that Hezbollah only has 3 out of 31 ministries in the new unity government. And then with respect to Israeli military operations, Qassem warned on Lebanese TV that he doesn't think Israel is interested in war, but that if war is launched, quote, we are ready, end quote.
Moving on, it's been just days since Prime Minister Netanyahu scheduled meetings with Russian President Vladimir Putin on February 21st in Moscow. And while there, the two are set to discuss Iran's growing presence in Syria. But now it seems that Russia and Iran will also be discussing Israel's anti-Iranian strikes in the region at a trilateral summit in Sochi next week.
Israeli leaders have admitted to hundreds of strikes against Iranian and Iranian proxy targets in Syria over the past few years, and Netanyahu has often vowed to continue to operate in the region as often as is necessary. Well, according to Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif, officials from Iran, Russia, and Turkey will all convene then on February 14th to discuss with the Russians, quote, the Israeli attacks on Syria, adding that Iran will respond to the Israeli attacks in a timely manner and in accordance with national interests. That being said, the stated primary focus of the meeting in Sochi will be to form the Syrian Constitutional Commission tasked with ending the Syrian civil war. Meanwhile, in Lebanon, Iranian proxy terror group Hezbollah is already using its new sway in the Lebanese government to ask for weapons from their Iranian benefactors. In fact, Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah on Wednesday challenged the Lebanese government to cooperate more fully with Iran, saying he wants to confront Israeli aircraft on Iran's behalf, and that he's willing to do, quote, whatever the Lebanese army needs to do to become the largest regional army, end quote. Actually, Nasrallah even spent over a full hour on a televised address praising Iran and the Ayatollah regime's accomplishments. This just after denying Israeli allegations that Hezbollah is just Iran's arm in Lebanon and in the newly formed Lebanese parliament.
Iran has proxies. One of them is Hezbollah. Hezbollah just joined the government of Lebanon. That's a misnomer. They actually control the government of Lebanon. And that means that Iran controls the government of Lebanon. And it's important to send this very powerful message. Just as we stopped the terror tunnels coming into Israel, we will stop all the aggression from Lebanon or from Syria or from Iran itself. We're committed to preventing this aggression. And in so doing, we're not only protecting ourselves, Israel itself, but also protecting our neighbors and world peace.
In other news, after 2 years in office and just ahead of this week's State of the Union address, United States President Donald Trump finally appointed a new special envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism. And the new State Department employee has been named as none other than Army veteran and Los Angeles prosecutor Ilan Carr.
The JTA and the Jewish Insider News networks broke the story earlier this week, revealing the 50-year-old Carr as the new appointee. And Carr served in Iraq as a military serviceman, in LA as an anti-gang prosecutor, and he was also the former president of Jewish college fraternity AEPI. And with credentials like those, among others, it then makes sense that his confirmation has been met with approval from the political left and right alike. In fact, Democratic Representative Eliot Engel of New York wrote that he welcomed the appointment of Ilan Carr, quote, a longtime leader in the American Jewish community, end quote. And Secretary of State Mike Pompeo also commented that Carr has already played a, quote, prominent role in defending the safety of the Jewish people at home and abroad, end quote. Though while Carr's appointment to the role has been met with praise, many, including most Jewish groups in the United States, have been pressuring Trump to fill the position since taking office 2 years ago, especially as anti-Semitic attacks have continued to progress across the country. Regardless, the position is filled now, and Carr will be hitting the ground running. He's already set to head off to Slovakia and Belgium this week for his first official trip in his new capacity, where he'll attend conferences in combating anti-Semitism in Europe and elsewhere.
All right, that's it for this week's Roundup. Tune in next week for the next episode of ILTV's Weekly Review. I'm Aaron Porras, and thank you for joining us.